The fluorescent lights buzzed like trapped wasps above the ICU corridor at Mercy General. Ashley Cooper pushed through the heavy doors at 05 for 5 hours, her badge clipped to the faded lanyard she'd worn for 3 years without anyone noticing the deliberate way she kept it face down. The antiseptic smell hit first, that sharp chemical bite mixed with floor wax and something underneath it, something like copper and old rain that never quite washed away. Her scrubs were standard issue, navy blue, unremarkable. Pockets empty except for a trauma pen and the small plastic bag folded into her left breast pocket, the one containing a unit patch so faded the embroidered insignia had nearly ghosted into nothing. She didn't walk like most nurses walked. Her gait was economical, purposeful, the movement of someone who'd learned to take up less space than her body occupied. A barely perceptible limp favored her right leg, the kind most people wouldn't notice unless they were trained to notice such things. The scar tissue running down her left shoulder, hidden beneath her scrubs, told a different story, the kind of story that didn't exist in her official file anymore. The Pentagon had scrubbed it clean 18 months ago, every deployment, every commendation, every name she'd carried out of Kandahar. To Mercy General, to Portland, to everyone who saw her punch a time card, Ashley Cooper was simply a civilian ICU nurse. Competent. Quiet. Forgettable. The charge nurse, Marcus, was already at the desk reviewing overnight admissions. He looked up as Ashley set her badge down and reached for the patient assignment clipboard. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for people who didn't really warrant full acknowledgement. She nodded without answering and scanned the patient list. Her eyes landed on room 347 and held there for exactly half a second before moving on. That was where General William Hatch lay, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision to the rhythm of the ventilator. His call sign, Reaper 6, was tattooed on his right forearm in letters so black they looked like ink shadows, a memorial to something neither of them was supposed to remember anymore. She'd carried him for kilometers through the Sanjin Valley with a collapsed lung of her own and his blood soaking through both their uniforms. That was 10 years ago. Before the extraction went wrong. Before the Pentagon decided she was an operational liability and made her legally dead. The morning rounds began at 0615 hours. Dr. Sterling arrived with his tablet, his white coat pristine, his shoes polished to a shine that suggested someone else cleaned them. He was early 50s, with the kind of face that had never known real hunger or real fear, the kind of voice that sounded like a tank idling in a garage, all power and no urgency because power itself was the point. He moved through the ICU with the authority of someone who'd mastered the art of looking busy while doing very little. The nurses parted around him like water around a stone. Ashley stood at the medication cart, double-checking the insulin infusions and the heparin drips, her documentation precise to the second. Every medication recorded with the time down to the minute. Every dosage, every response, every change in the patient's condition. The way she charted was meticulous in a way that made some of the other nurses uncomfortable, the kind of documentation that left no room for ambiguity, the kind that could be audited and verified and traced to its source with absolute certainty. She'd been tracking the Veteran Care Fund discrepancies for 14 months now, quietly, in a separate notebook that lived in the zippered pocket of her locker. Phantom procedures. Insurance billings that didn't match the actual treatments provided. Nearly $2 million that had moved through the system in ways that would require explanation if anyone with real authority ever looked closely enough. Dr. Sterling had been moving that money for 18 months. He'd been doing it systematically, methodically, with the kind of precision that suggested this wasn't his first time managing a fraud of this magnitude. What he didn't know was that Ashley had spent 3 years learning to notice things most people missed, the way inconsistencies accumulated, the way small lies added up to large ones, the way paper trails always left a mark if you knew where to look. She'd been looking. He stopped at the medication cart. Ashley was reviewing a patient's morning labs, her posture perfectly neutral, her expression the careful blank mask of someone who'd learned to be invisible in rooms where powerful men stood. Sterling glanced at her over the edge of his tablet, and something in his expression shifted. A recognition, maybe, or the beginning of one. Not recognition that she was dangerous. Just recognition that she was in the way. Medication timing on room 344, he said. Not a question. A statement that hung in the air like a test. Ashley didn't look up. Metoprolol at 0530. Exact time documented. Patient response recorded at 0532 when systolic dropped to 118. Held the next dose pending your review. Her voice came out steady and quiet, the voice of someone reporting facts that didn't require interpretation. 10 words exactly. She'd learned to count. Sterling's jaw tightened, but he moved on. He didn't linger. That was the thing about invisible people, you could be in the same room with them and never really see them at all. She watched him pause at room 347, where General Hatch lay motionless, his vital signs displayed on the monitor like a poem written in numbers. For a moment, Sterling stood in the doorway, just looking. Then he turned away without entering. The morning rounds continued. Ashley followed at appropriate distance, her presence so unremarkable that the residents barely glanced at her when she offered clarifications on patient status. She knew the history on every patient, the subtle shifts in their condition that the daytime teams would miss, the small interventions that had prevented codes and complications. That knowledge lived in her hands and her careful charting, available to anyone who bothered to look closely. Few people did. Few people looked at the quiet nurse with the downcast eyes and saw anything worth examining. At 0700 hours, the department began its formal transition. The overnight nurses gave report to the day shift. Ashley was assigned for patients, including room 347. She moved into General Hatch's room carrying a fresh fur bag and a blood draw kit, her movements economical and precise. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, the monitor displaying a steady sinus rhythm at 72 beats per minute. His blood pressure was solid. His oxygen saturation was excellent. Everything about his current trajectory suggested recovery, slow, medically supervised, but recovery nonetheless. She checked his foresight first, noting the dressing was clean and dry. Then she drew his morning labs with the kind of technical precision that came from 10 years of practice, the needle going in clean and steady, the blood flowing into the tube with that small sighing sound like a secret being told. His numbers are good, she said quietly, knowing he couldn't hear her but saying it anyway. Habit, maybe. Or something else. Something that insisted on bearing witness even when the world wasn't watching. She charted the exact time 0703 hours. Lab work ordered by Sterling at 0630. Drawn by Ashley Cooper at 0703. No deviation from protocol. Perfect documentation. The kind of careful record that would hold up under scrutiny. But that wasn't the worst part of what Dr. Sterling was beginning to understand. By 0730 hours, Ashley had taken her assigned station at the medication cart. The break room would be hers at 0800 for exactly 30 minutes. That was where she'd sit with her coffee, black, no sugar, and exist in the kind of solitude that only came from being profoundly unremarkable. The other nurses knew better than to try to include her in their conversations. She'd made it clear through 3 years of quiet rejection that she preferred the company of silence. They honored that preference because she was useful and competent and never caused problems. The kind of nurse who made everyone else's job easier by simply doing her own work without drama or complaint. What they didn't know was that the Pentagon had ordered her into this ghost life. That the woman who served with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, had been classified as deceased in every official record the moment the extraction went wrong in Kandahar. That she'd spent 3 years watching the man she'd saved in that valley lie in a hospital bed 3 floors above her, his memories of their shared trauma erased by medical necessity and time and the careful distance she maintained. The nightmares were hers to carry alone. The scar tissue was hers to hide beneath scrubs. The unit patch in her locker was hers to fold and refold, a ghost of an identity that no longer existed on paper. Sterling was beginning to calculate. She could see it in the way he moved through the unit now, the way his attention had sharpened. A nurse who documented perfectly. Who charted every detail with obsessive precision. Who worked the ICU where Veteran Care Fund billing went through the system. It was a small connection, maybe, but Sterling had built his entire operation on small connections, on the assumption that people saw what they wanted to see. A quiet nurse. A man of authority. A money stream that had been flowing undisturbed for a year and a half. He didn't yet understand that she was both more and less than what he saw. That the hands checking those 4 sites had held Marines together on the battlefield. That the eyes looking down at his tablet were trained to read violence in its embryonic stages, in the small decisions that preceded the larger ones. That beneath the forgettable exterior lived something Sterling was about to learn the hard way: you never saw the threat coming. Not the real one. It was always the quiet ones. She finished the morning medication rounds at 07 for 5 hours. Everything documented. Everything perfect. Everything waiting. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song above the nurse's station as Sterling taped the write-up to the public board during shift change. Room 347. Patient medication administration at 080 for hours instead of 0800 hours. For minutes. He'd written it in his careful, elegant script, the handwriting of a man who'd spent 18 years perfecting his appearance of precision while his offshore accounts grew fat with phantom billing codes. Ashley saw it happen from across the unit, her hand steady as she restocked the medication cart. One of the newer nurses, Tyler, whistled low and glanced at her. "That's brutal, man." She didn't look up. She'd learned long ago that acknowledgement of cruelty only invited more of it, a lesson from Kandahar that had somehow translated perfectly to fluorescent corridors and beeping monitors. Sterling's voice cut across the station like a scalpel finding tissue. "Nurse Cooper, when I write standing orders for 0800 medication administration, I don't mean 0804. Perhaps you need remedial training on how to read a clock, or is basic time telling beyond your capabilities?" He delivered it with a smile, the kind of smile that made it sound like concern, like he was genuinely worried for her competence. That was his gift, the ability to humiliate while maintaining the appearance of professionalism. General Hatch's daughter Sarah was there, visiting her father, standing 10 feet away at the nurse's station with a cardboard box of homemade cookies that would never be eaten. Her face went red as she watched her father's nurse be dismantled in front of a dozen witnesses. The general himself lay in room 347 with his eyes closed, medically sedated, unaware that his call sign, Reaper 6, was permanently inked on his forearm, a tattoo from a lifetime ago when he'd been a lieutenant and Ashley had carried him for kilometers through sniper fire in Kandahar with her own collapsed lung, her own blood soaking through her uniform, her own will the only thing keeping them both moving. Ashley took one measured breath. Her jaw tightened, just barely, the muscle working once and then going still. She turned from the medication cart to face Sterling directly, and she let a single tear trace her left cheek. Just one. Not trembling. Not broken. Just present, acknowledging the cruelty without surrendering to it. She wiped it away with her thumb and her voice came out like still water, no ripples, no current, just absolute depth underneath. "Sir, my documentation is available for your review whenever you find the courage." 3 nurses looked away. 2 suddenly became fascinated by their phones. Sarah Hatch's mouth opened slightly, then closed. She understood what had just happened. Ashley hadn't defended herself. She hadn't argued the medical facts of a 4-minute deviation in a patient on prophylactic antibiotics. She'd simply redirected Sterling's energy back toward him with the certainty of someone who already knew exactly what those records showed. Sterling's jaw clenched, just a flicker, and he turned away without responding. That was the moment he decided to destroy her completely. The break room became her exile over the next week. It wasn't official, wasn't written policy, but it was devastating in its precision. Every time Ashley entered, conversation stopped like someone had flipped a switch. Nurses grabbed their lunches and left within 30 seconds. The smell of stale coffee and antiseptic would linger in the empty room as she sat alone with her homemade sandwich, watching through the glass partition as 8 staff members laughed together in the conference room, the door deliberately shut against her. Sterling had been conducting what he called informal conversations with each staff member about the concerns regarding Nurse Cooper's emotional stability and obsessive focus on certain patients. He never said she was dangerous, he was too smart for that. He just asked quiet questions. "Have you noticed anything concerning? Anything that makes you uncomfortable?" and then let their imaginations do the work. By Friday, Ashley ate lunch in her car, sitting in the Portland rain with the windows fogging up, her hands wrapped around a thermos of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The dressing down came on a Thursday morning in room 319. Sterling orchestrated it like a conductor preparing a symphony. The Morrison family, Gold Star parents whose Marine son had died in Kandahar 3 years ago, were present for a routine wound care procedure. Ashley was changing a post-operative dressing on Mrs. Morrison's husband, who'd suffered a massive stroke and was in the early stages of recovery. Her hands moved with the textbook precision of someone who'd performed this procedure 10,000 times. Sterile field. Clean technique. Gentle pressure on the wound. Everything perfect. Sterling burst through the door like he'd been summoned by emergency alarm. Nurse Cooper, this sterile technique is absolutely unacceptable. Are you trying to give this patient an infection? His voice carried the manufactured shock of someone discovering a horrific crime in progress, though Ashley's technique was immaculate and he knew it. He turned to the Morrison family with theatrical concern painted across his face. I apologize you had to witness such substandard care. Nurse Cooper has been struggling lately. We're monitoring the situation closely. He said it with the tone of someone discussing a troubled employee with generosity and compassion, the kind of performance that made his lie sound like truth. Ashley's hands didn't shake as she continued the dressing change. She'd learned in Kandahar that your hands are the last thing to break, they remember their work even when your mind is screaming. Mrs. Morrison's face crumbled with worry. Mr. Morrison's eyes darted between Ashley and Sterling with the confusion of someone trying to understand what was happening. Sterling added one final strike, casual as a knife slipping between ribs. Some people just aren't cut out for high-stakes medicine. Maybe you'd be happier at a nursing home, nobody nurse. The nickname spread through Mercy General within 2 days. Nobody nurse. The woman who'd carried a Marine general through enemy territory with her own lung collapsing with every step, now reduced to that, a nothing, a nobody, a nurse without identity or competence. What Sterling didn't know was that Ashley had spent 3 years as a ghost, living with a name that wasn't legally hers, watching the man she'd saved forget her face entirely because the Pentagon had scrubbed her service records and told her she was dead. She'd spent 3 years learning how to disappear so completely that even her presence became invisible. Sterling thought he was breaking her with isolation and humiliation. He didn't understand that she was already broken in ways he couldn't comprehend, already shattered and reassembled and shaped into something harder than his cruelty could touch. But that wasn't the worst part. On Wednesday night at 02 for 5 hours, Ashley's world compressed into a single moment of absolute clarity. She was conducting routine vitals on General Hatch when she noticed his chest rising unevenly, the left side expanding normally while the right remained flat, locked, refusing to move. His trachea had deviated noticeably toward the right side of his neck. His oxygen saturation was dropping fast, 96% at 02 for 4, now 89% at 02 for 6. His heart rate climbing to 134, his skin going pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the chest cavity, crushing his right lung, shifting his heart with every breath. 18 minutes from cardiac arrest if untreated. Maybe less. Ashley paged the on-call physician, Dr. Reeves, who arrived within 3 minutes, examined the general, reviewed the monitors, and then his cell phone rang. He read the screen and something flickered across his face, recognition, resignation, fear. I've been urgently requested in the ER for a critical trauma, he said, not quite meeting Ashley's eyes. Transfer this patient to Dr. Morrison. He left. Dr. Morrison arrived. Began reviewing the chart. Her phone buzzed. She read the message and said, I'm being pulled to OR3 for an emergency. Page Dr. Williams. She left. Dr. Williams examined the general, ordered a stat chest X-ray, and received a page on the overhead system. Dr. Williams, call the surgical director immediately. 3 minutes later, I've been transferred off this case by administration. Contact Dr. Patel. She left. Dr. Patel. Dr. Chen. Dr. Rodriguez. Dr. Harrison. 12 doctors over 18 minutes, each arriving, each looking at the deteriorating Marine General with his deviating trachea and plummeting oxygen, each receiving a page or a call or a message, each leaving with varying degrees of urgency and shame written across their faces. Through the glass partition of room 347, Ashley could see Sterling at the nurse's station, his phone in hand, making calls with the satisfied expression of a man executing a perfectly choreographed plan. He was ensuring that the General's condition would deteriorate past the point where even the most aggressive intervention could save him. He was ensuring that the medical record would show abandonment by a cascade of physicians, that the blame would disperse so widely across the hospital that no single person could be held accountable. He was ensuring that Ashley would have to watch it happen. Sarah Hatch arrived for her nightly visit at 0258 hours. She pushed through the ICU doors with a paper bag of homemade soup, saw her father through the doorway, his face turning dusky, his fingers already starting to take on a bluish tint despite the oxygen at 15 liters per minute, and she screamed. Just one word, pure sound, the noise of a daughter watching her father die while the world did nothing. Why isn't anyone helping him? The room went dead silent. 3 nurses froze at the station. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. A monitor somewhere down the unit beeped in steady 4/4 time, counting down the seconds that remained. Ashley stood alone at the medication cart. She looked at the General, still sedated, unaware. She looked at Sarah, whose face was dissolving into panic. She looked at the empty hallway where 12 doctors had come and gone like ghosts, doing exactly what Sterling had orchestrated. She reached for the supply drawer. Her hands moved on their own. At 02 for 5 hours on a Wednesday night, Ashley noticed it during her routine vitals check, the rise and fall of General Hatch's chest no longer matched. Left side expanding in its familiar rhythm. Right side completely still, as if the air had nowhere to go. She placed her palm against his ribs. Nothing. The left side pushed against her hand while the right remained motionless, an asymmetry that meant only one thing to someone who'd spent 3 years as a ghost learning to recognize what most people missed. His trachea was deviating sharply to the right. The breathing tube was still in place, delivering oxygen like it always did, but something inside him was collapsing. She glanced at the monitor. Oxygen saturation dropping. 94, 91. 88. Not the gradual decline of a normal shift. This was a plummet. A cascade. A timer counting down from something called a tension pneumothorax, air pressure building in the space between lung and chest wall, crushing the tissue inward like an invisible fist. She knew what that looked like inside a person. She'd seen it in Kandahar when shrapnel punctured lungs and nobody had time to care about the patient's name. Air gets trapped where it shouldn't. Pressure builds. The lung collapses. The heart gets compressed. Then nothing. For minutes, maybe 5, before the pressure stops the heart from beating entirely. Ashley reached for the phone. Her voice came out steady, the kind of steady that lives in people who've learned the difference between panic and precision. ICU, this is room 347. I need an on-call physician. Stat. The operator connected her to the first physician on rotation, Dr. Martinez, who'd been pleasant enough in the hallway, who'd actually made eye contact. His voice came through the line with the particular exhaustion of someone working their 3rd overnight shift in a week. What are we looking at? He asked. Tension pneumothorax. Right side. Tracheal deviation. O2 sat 86 and falling. Patient is sedated but decompensating rapidly. Eta. Pause. Not the pause of someone thinking. The pause of someone listening to something else. Then, I'm getting paged to trauma. Incoming multi-vehicle collision on 405. I'm being diverted. Who's the backup? I don't know. Please? He'd already hung up. Ashley called again. The operator transferred her to the second physician, Dr. Keane, a cardiologist who technically wasn't even on the ICU roster but had been the next name on the emergency list. His answer came so fast it sounded rehearsed. I was just informed patient 347 is being transferred to Oregon Health Sciences. The case is no longer here. He's not being transferred. I'm looking at him. He's... Click. The third physician didn't answer at all. The fourth said his services were no longer needed on this patient. The fifth was paged away before she could even finish her explanation. The sixth, seventh, and eighth followed in succession, a coordinated retreat that Ashley recognized from her years watching military operations collapse. This wasn't incompetence. This was a network executing a plan. By the ninth phone call, the oxygen saturation had dropped to 79. The monitor's alarm was screaming in short, accusatory beeps. The general's chest was still asymmetrical, that terrible still right side a testament to something dying underneath his ribs. The 10th doctor said he needed to speak with Dr. Sterling first. The 11th said she was unavailable and would have to call back. The 12th physician, Ashley counted them like bullet holes in a wall, didn't answer at all. 12 doctors. That's what Sterling had bought with his network. Not incompetence or cowardice necessarily, though some of it was that. But mostly, 12 simultaneous decisions made by people who'd learned that answering this particular call carried consequences they couldn't afford. Ashley set down the phone. General Hatch's oxygen saturation hit 72. She moved toward the emergency supply cart with the kind of movement that came from muscle memory burned into her nervous system in places she wasn't allowed to remember. Her hands found the drawer. Her fingers identified the 14-gauge needle catheter by touch alone, just like she'd identified enemy positions in darkness, like she'd identified friendlies from hostile fire using only sound. The needle was 12 centimeters long, thin enough to slip between ribs, sharp enough to puncture through tissue that no surgeon would ever touch in a hospital like this. Sarah Hatch was standing in the corner, the general's daughter, her face a study in the particular terror of watching someone bleed out without blood. Ashley met her eyes. Not asking permission. Not requesting consent. Just informing someone of what was about to happen because they deserved the truth before the world changed. Your father has a tension pneumothorax. The air pressure is collapsing his lung and crushing his heart. I'm performing a needle decompression. This is off protocol without physician orders. I will likely be fired. But he will die in the next 3 minutes without intervention. Ashley's voice came out like still water. Like steel under ice. Do you understand? Sarah's head moved in what might have been a nod. Ashley swabbed the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line with betadine, the exact point where rib met air, where anatomy dictated the path between the neurovascular bundle that ran under each rib like a train on rails. She positioned the needle at a 90-degree angle, perpendicular to his chest wall, and pressed forward with the kind of controlled pressure that separates between intent and violence. The needle went through skin, muscle, fascia, the membrane that separated his rib cage from the dying space inside. Then it broke through into pressure. The hiss that erupted from the needle's hub sounded like opening a pressurized container after it's been sealed for days. The sound of air escaping under force, of physics reasserting itself, of pressure finding equilibrium. It was loud enough that both women heard it clearly in the quiet room. It was the sound of survival. The general's chest wall began to equalize within seconds. The right side rose slightly as the pressure released. His trachea shifted back toward midline like it was correcting course. The monitor's oxygen saturation climbed like someone pulling a person out of the ocean, 75, 80, 85, 87, 91. His heart rate began dropping back toward normal range, the frantic electrical firing giving way to something approaching rhythm. Ashley secured the catheter with tape, her hands moving with the precision of someone who'd done this in conditions far worse than an ICU room with fluorescent lights and climate control. She picked up the phone and called Dr. Kumar, a resident who'd shown her kindness once by actually remembering her name. His voice came through uncertain. Room 347 again, he asked quietly. Needle decompression completed. Patient needs a proper chest tube for ongoing management. I can't leave this catheter in place indefinitely. Dr. Kumar was there in 12 minutes. His hands shook slightly as he inserted the larger tube, as he threaded it between ribs with a gentleness that suggested he already knew something had gone wrong with the ordinary functioning of this hospital. He didn't ask questions. He didn't make eye contact. He just worked, the way people do when they've decided they don't want to know the answer. The general's oxygen saturation stabilized at 96. His trachea stayed centered. His heart rate settled into a rhythm that was almost restful by comparison to the chaos of an hour before. Ashley finished her shift documentation at 0600 hours. She wrote every detail. Every vital sign. Every intervention. Every second of the timeline. The needle going in. The hiss of air. The O2 sac climbing. She documented it all with the same meticulous precision that had started Dr. Sterling's panic 7 weeks ago, the paperwork of someone who'd been trained to build a record that couldn't be questioned. But that wasn't the worst part. Sterling activated his network before the sun rose. 2 board members called her into separate emergency meetings, one at 0600 and another at 0700, their voices carrying the particular tone of people delivering prepared statements. They questioned her unauthorized medical procedures. They used the word vigilante like it was something that needed sanitizing. An outside hospital investigator materialized by 0800 with a briefcase containing fabricated complaints from anonymous staff about Ashley's instability and boundary violations with patient 347. By 0900, the director of nursing terminated her employment effective immediately, citing gross violation of scope of practice and unauthorized invasive procedures. Security footage from the ICU had mysteriously corrupted for the specific time period in question, a blank digital void where the needle going in should have existed. Ashley's nursing references received calls within the hour containing vague allegations of concerning behavior and emotional attachment to patients that would poison her ability to work anywhere else in Portland. Maybe anywhere else, period. She walked out of Mercy General at 0930 hours, still in her scrubs, holding nothing but her employee badge and the particular exhaustion of someone who'd just saved a life and lost everything in the space between one shift and the next. The rain was coming down the way it does in Portland, not violent, just persistent, the kind of rain that doesn't stop but never quite becomes a storm. It soaked through the fabric of her shirt as she stood at the bus stop on Burnside, watching cars pass in a blur of chrome and brake lights, wondering how many people in this city had saved lives and been punished for it, how many had learned to choose between survival and conscience and had chosen conscience anyway. The general was alive. That was the only metric that mattered. That was the only medal that meant anything. But as she waited for a bus that kept not arriving, that felt like the saddest victory she'd ever won. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause for a performance nobody wanted to watch. Ashley stood at the bus stop on Burnside, 77 minutes after her termination, the cardboard box disintegrating in her arms. Inside it, a cracked mug reading "World's Okayest Nurse," a dying succulent she never remembered to water, and a photograph of Lieutenant Commander James Morrison sealed in plastic. Morrison. The only person who'd known where she really was. The only person who'd kept her classified status buried even from his own family before the training accident 6 months after Kandahar took him away. The hospital loomed behind her, all glass and steel and lights, all the machines keeping people alive while she stood in the rain letting everything fall apart. A man in a business suit waiting for the same bus looked at her with pity and moved away slightly, as if failure might be contagious. She didn't blame him. She looked like a ghost. She felt like one. But what happened in the hour after the needle decompression was worse than any public humiliation Sterling had orchestrated. Worse because it was methodical. Worse because it worked. The intercom crackled at 0905 hours. Ashley Cooper to administration. Ashley Cooper to administration immediately. Not please come down. Not a request. A command delivered in the neutral tone that meant someone had already decided your fate before you walked into the room. The director of nursing was waiting with 2 board members and Dr. Sterling arranged in chairs like a tribunal. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a sickly yellow wash. Ashley closed the door behind herself and stood, not sat, knowing that sitting would mean accepting the outcome as final. The director cleared her throat. She'd always seemed decent until this moment. Nurse Cooper, we need to discuss the events in room 347 at 02 for 5 hours this morning. Sterling leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. His voice carried the calculated sympathy of a man who'd rehearsed this speech. Your unauthorized needle decompression, regardless of outcome, represents a fundamental violation of the physician-nurse hierarchy. You performed a procedure requiring physician oversight without orders. I called 12 doctors, Ashley said. Her voice was steady as surgical steel. All 12 refused. One of the board members, a man with a Harvard Law Review diploma on his wall, didn't even look up from his notes. We've reviewed the call logs. The paging system shows no evidence of those pages reaching attending physicians. All documentation is consistent with your actions being entirely unprompted. Ashley's jaw tightened. The security footage from room 347 would have shown everything. The 12 refusals. The desperate minutes. The moment when she stopped waiting and moved. But the security footage from 0245 to 0300 hours was corrupted. Sterling's people had made sure of that. The backup drives had malfunctioned. The analog tapes had been marked for erasure in routine Monday morning procedures. Sterling continued, this hospital cannot employ someone who believes rules don't apply to them. Your references are being contacted today. We're obligated to inform other institutions about conduct that could jeopardize patient safety. That was the real knife. Not the firing. Not even the humiliation. References. One phone call to her previous employers, none of whom could verify anything because her entire work history before 6 months ago was falsified, and those calls would tell just enough of a story. Instability. Unauthorized procedures. Not a team player. The director slid a termination letter across the polished table. A severance check for 2 weeks. A separation agreement on thick cream-colored paper. Ashley picked up the agreement. The non-disparagement clause was on page 2. I cannot discuss the hospital, its employees, its practices, or any event that occurred on hospital grounds with anyone, under penalty of civil litigation and financial damages up to $100,000. Sterling was watching her face, waiting to see the moment she broke. Waiting to see her hand shake as she signed away her right to ever speak about what he'd done, about the 12 doctors, about any of it. She didn't sign. She placed her hospital badge on the desk instead. The laminated ID with her name and her photograph, a stranger in scrubs, hair pulled back, eyes carefully empty. She turned and walked out while Sterling's smile faltered, while the director started to say something, while the board members exchanged glances that meant they'd expected compliance. Security, the same guard who'd watched her work for 6 months, escorted her to her locker at 0928 hours. The cardboard box was waiting. Everything she'd brought to Mercy General fit into 3 square feet of space, a cracked ceramic mug from a Secret Santa exchange 2 years ago, a plant someone had given her when she transferred to ICU that she'd let slowly die through negligence and spite, and Morrison's photograph. Lieutenant Commander James Morrison. Callsign Bear. The SEAL who'd trained her. The man who'd told her after the Pentagon scrubbed her records, you're doing the hardest thing a warrior can do, disappearing so others can be safe. Your legend dies so good men live. She held the photograph through the protective plastic and wondered if Morrison would think this was worth it. She wondered if General Hatch even knew she existed. She wondered if saving his life had meant anything at all if nobody could know she'd done it. The rain soaked through her scrubs as she waited at the bus stop. It was 1,047 hours on a Monday morning in Portland, and she was unemployed, professionally poisoned, and legally dead. The rain smelled like diesel exhaust and wet concrete. A siren wailed in the distance, getting closer, then fading toward a different emergency. She thought about Kandahar. She thought about carrying Lieutenant Hatch for kilometers through sniper fire with a collapsed lung of her own, his blood on her hands, her breath coming in ragged gasps, thinking only that he would not die, that nobody under her watch would die, that if she had to drag him all the way to Jordan by herself she would do it. She thought about stitching him back together in a field hospital with trembling hands and whatever supplies hadn't been shot to pieces. She thought about his eyes finding hers, his mouth trying to form words, and her saying, "Don't talk, Lieutenant. Just breathe." She'd kept him alive. And it had cost her everything. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was standing in the rain, watching a man in business casual move away from her like she was contagious, knowing that Sterling was upstairs in his office right now, deleting emails, sanitizing records, confident that she was finished. Knowing that her only recourse was silence. Knowing that the non-disparagement clause had teeth, the Pentagon would never let her speak publicly anyway. Classified operations didn't have statute of limitations, and if she tried to go to the media or to the hospital board with proof of Sterling's fraud, her own classified status would become a liability. She was trapped by the thing that was supposed to protect her. The box was falling apart. The cardboard had absorbed so much rain it was dissolving at the edges. Morrison's photograph was still protected in plastic, but everything else was about to become pulp. She stood at the bus stop and felt like a failure. Not for losing her job. Not even for the impossibility of proving anything against Sterling. But for being a civilian nurse when what she needed to be was a warrior. Warriors didn't stand at bus stops in the rain. Warriors didn't let people like Sterling walk away clean. The rain intensified. It hammered against the plastic shelter, against the street, against the windows of the hospital behind her where people in scrubs were walking through hallways, clocking in for shifts, unaware that she'd already clocked out forever. 77 minutes. That's how long it took for salvation to arrive. That's how long she stood in the rain before the sound changed from ambient Seattle winter background noise to something different. Something mechanical. Something that made the air pressure shift and every person at the bus stop look up at the sky. The sound of helicopter rotors cutting through clouds. The sound of a Chinook landing on the rooftop of Mercy General, directly above the 5th floor ICU where General Hatch was waking up from his medically induced coma, where nurses were checking his vitals, where Dr. Sterling was probably still trying to figure out how to explain the suddenly operational patient he'd tried to sabotage. The sound of the world about to remember who Ashley Cooper really was. The rotor wash hit the ICU windows like judgment. 1-2-3 seconds of pure percussion as the Chinook descended onto Mercy General's rooftop at 1,204 hours, exactly 77 minutes after Ashley's termination papers were signed. The building shook. Fluorescent lights swayed on their suspended chains. On the 3rd floor, monitors beeped their protest while nurses froze mid-step, coffee cups halted halfway to lips. Ashley stood at the bus stop 2 blocks away, cardboard box against her chest, when she heard it. The rotor wash didn't fade. It intensified. That wasn't a medevac. That was military. That was serious. That was the sound of a decision that had already been made somewhere in a Pentagon building she'd never see again. She didn't move. Just listened to the percussion fade into something else, boots. Coordinated footsteps. The kind of approach that meant people had trained together for years. The kind of footsteps that made civilians instinctively step back. In the administrative wing of Mercy General, a Marine Force Recon colonel in dress blues walked through the doors with 4 Navy personnel flanking him like a living wall. His shoulders had the particular geometry of someone who'd carried weight through mountain passes for a living. His face had been hammered by sun and purpose into something that didn't negotiate. He stepped directly to the information desk. Not a request in his voice. A command. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper. Callsign Reaper 6. I'm looking for immediate recall authorization to be delivered personally. The receptionist, who'd smiled at Ashley exactly twice in 3 years, blinked. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand. You don't need to understand. You need to find her. Now. The colonel's presence had the specific gravity of someone accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around him. Within 90 seconds, the director of nursing had been located. Within 2 minutes, the lobby was beginning to accumulate the kind of crowd that happens when people sense something seismic is occurring. Dr. Sterling emerged from his office like a man stepping into a room he didn't recognize. He saw the uniforms first. Then the medals. Then the colonel's eyes, which were the color of storm-dark water and carried the weight of decisions that had ended wars. Sterling's face did something complicated. His jaw moved once, closed, then moved again. Ashley was walking back toward the hospital when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered without speaking. Senior Chief, this is Commander Torres, JSOC Medical Liaison. You've been recalled to active duty effective immediately. Report to Mercy General Administrative Wing. Do not speak to anyone. Do not remove your credentials. Walk straight to the lobby. The line went dead. She didn't ask how long it would take. She didn't ask why. Her feet were already moving, the way they moved in Kandahar when the radio crackled with fire missions and the ground beneath you became negotiable. The cardboard box went into a hospital trash can on the corner. The dying succulent followed. The photo of her SEAL team leader was tucked into her scrub pocket. The general's daughter was already in the lobby when Ashley arrived, standing beside the Marine colonel with a manila folder clutched against her ribs like it contained proof of resurrection. Sarah Hatch was trembling, not with fear, but with the particular earthquake that happens when 3 years of confusion finally resolves into terrible clarity. She read from the declassified file with a voice that sounded like it was breaking. Navy Cross recipient for heroic action under direct enemy fire. Kandahar Province, March 2012. Saved 17 Marines under sustained fire. Carried my father 4 kilometers through enemy territory with a collapsed lung of her own. 3 Purple Hearts. Distinguished Service Medal. Recommended for promotion to Master Chief Petty Officer but service record sealed and classified pending. Her voice caught. She looked directly at Ashley. Pending recovery of the patient for whom she'd sacrificed operational security. A Navy SEAL commander in dress blues stepped forward. His voice carried the particular weight of someone who'd survived catastrophes that still couldn't be discussed. Silver Star for Valor in Combat Operations, 2010 to 2011. Pause. The hospital staff held its breath. 2 Purple Hearts, separate citations. The director of nursing's hand went to her mouth. 1 additional Purple Heart for injury sustained during the extraction that cost her her discharge classification and her name. Dr. Sterling's face had gone the color of old bone. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish removed from water. Around him, people he'd walked past in corridors for years were beginning to understand something about invisible currencies and power that couldn't be transferred or purchased. The SEAL commander's voice dropped another octave. And a Navy Cross. The highest military decoration for valor short of the Medal of Honor. This woman was your ICU nurse for 3 years while the Pentagon classified her entire service record. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the Marine colonel turned to face Dr. Sterling with the parade ground bearing of someone about to deliver consequences that had been waiting their entire careers to be issued. Dr. Sterling. Your hospital privileges are terminated effective immediately by order of the Department of Defense Medical Affairs. Surrender your credentials now. Sterling's hand shook as he reached for his badge. The lanyard trembled. The plastic rectangle slipped once, twice, before he managed to pull it over his head. His voice cracked when he tried to speak. This is civilian jurisdiction. You can't terminate my... Commander Torres stepped forward and her voice cut through the protest like a scalpel. We have every authority when you deliberately interfered with emergency medical care of a retired Marine general through systematic obstruction of physician response to a life-threatening emergency. 12 physicians were contacted and diverted by your direct interference. Phone records. Calendar records. Paging system logs. All documented. 2 FBI agents in dark suits emerged from the corridor where they'd been standing with the particular patients of people who knew exactly how this interview would end. One of them held a warrant that had probably been issued before the helicopter even landed. Dr. Lawrence Sterling, the agent said, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and theft from federal veteran assistance programs totaling $2,300,000 over 18 months. You have the right to remain silent. The handcuffs looked almost gentle as they closed around Sterling's wrists. Almost. "This is entrapment," Sterling shouted, the words becoming increasingly unmoored from reality. "She was planted here. This is a setup." "She was." The Marine colonel's voice cut through the noise like a command that stopped firefights. Senior Chief Cooper was assigned to Mercy General by random VA job placement protocol. She didn't even know General Hatch was admitted to her ICU until he arrived 6 weeks ago. You destroyed her career because her competence threatened to expose fraud. You attempted to sabotage emergency medical care to a general officer because saving him would have left a documentation trail leading directly to your theft. You're not a victim, Dr. Sterling. You're a coward who stole from veterans and then tried to kill a patient to cover it. The FBI agents moved past Sterling like water flowing around a stone. They didn't drag him. They didn't need to. The gravity of what he'd done was doing that work for them. News cameras, alerted by the hospital's own PR department about a special military recognition ceremony, captured every second. Sterling's face cycled through colors that didn't exist in nature. Red. White. Red again. When he tried to make eye contact with Ashley as the agents guided him toward the lobby doors, she looked through him like he was fog. Like he was nothing. Like he'd never existed at all. The director of nursing approached Ashley with legal counsel hovering behind her like anxious shadows. The offer came out already prepared, probably typed up during the colonel's first sentence. Reinstatement. Full back pay. Formal apology. Early promotion considerations. Ashley's voice emerged in that particular register she'd learned in Kandahar, the voice of someone who'd already survived the worst thing that could happen and had nothing left to negotiate with except truth. I'll consider your offer after I complete my recalled active duty orders. And after you explain to General Hatch's family why 12 physicians abandoned a patient in crisis. Sarah Hatch stepped beside Ashley and her voice carried the same precise weight. My father would want her reinstated with a formal commendation and a public apology printed in the hospital newsletter. And a full investigation into the systematic obstruction of his care. The Marine colonel presented Ashley with a service medal case containing the physical embodiment of 3 years of erasure and 1 moment of defiance. Behind it came the original SEAL team patch, the same one she'd torn from her own uniform sleeve in Kandahar to mark General Hatch as one of her people before the medevac arrived. Commander Torres stepped forward with precision and ritual. Each ribbon went into place with the particular reverence of someone who understood that these weren't decorations. They were proof. Proof that she'd existed. Proof that she'd mattered. Proof that the Pentagon had seen her sacrifice and classified it instead of celebrating it. Proof that she was no longer invisible. The hospital staff who'd left break rooms when Ashley entered, who'd whispered about the quiet nurse with steady hands and careful eyes, watched in absolute silence as a career that had been erased was reconstructed in front of them, ribbon by ribbon, moment by moment, in the place where she'd been most alone. Ashley's hospital badge appeared in the director's hands moments later. The lamination was still damp. Her name was now accompanied by her full rank. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper. And beneath that, a single line, Mercy General Veterans Medical Wing Staff, commended for valor. 3 weeks later, General Hatch woke from his medically induced coma with his daughter holding his hand. His first words weren't to Sarah. They were to the nurse standing at the foot of his bed, checking his flow rate with hands that had carried him through Kandahar and through the darkness of a hospital system that had tried to kill him. Reaper 6? Still here, General. His eyes, which had been blank and distant, focused on her with sudden crystalline clarity. Recognition. Understanding. The moment when 3 years of classified service became real again. I knew you wouldn't let them take me. The physical therapy sessions began 2 weeks later. General Hatch's legs had forgotten how to remember their purpose. Ashley guided him through the relearning with the same patient precision she'd used when carrying him through desert fire, 1 meter at a time, 1 step at a time, 1 moment of recovery after another. 6 months after Sterling's arrest, after the trial and the conviction and the sentencing, Ashley walked past a strip mall on Outer Powell Boulevard where a sad grey building held an even sadder man at a folding table. The banner above his head read Sterling Insurance Solutions, Auto, Home, Life. The plastic was faded. The lettering was peeling. Dr. Lawrence Sterling, no longer Dr. Anything, was cold calling from a purchased lead list with the desperation of someone who'd discovered that losing everything was different than earning nothing. He saw her pass in her Navy service uniform. His face contorted into something between rage and the specific humiliation of a man who discovered that consequences actually existed. Ashley didn't break stride. Didn't glance sideways. Didn't give him the moment of acknowledgement he was trying to extract from her presence. She just kept walking toward Mercy General's entrance where Sarah Hatch was waiting with the faded unit patch they'd found sewn into General Hatch's jacket lining all those years ago, the same patch Ashley had torn from her own sleeve in Kandahar to mark him as hers. The lobby had changed. There was a permanent plaque being unveiled, the Ashley Cooper Senior Chief Petty Officer Veterans Care Wing, dedicated to those who serve in uniform and in scrubs. General Hatch sat in a wheelchair wearing a marine dress uniform, his legs still recovering but his presence undeniable. He read from prepared remarks in a voice that had recovered its authority. This woman carried me through 4 kilometers of enemy fire with a collapsed lung. Then she protected me for 3 years without recognition. Then she saved my life again when she could have walked away. That's not just bravery. That's honor. The hospital staff applauded. Some of them were the same people who'd whispered about her competence. Some of them were genuinely changed. Some of them would learn from this moment for decades. When reporters asked Ashley about that night, about Sterling's sabotage, about the 12 doctors who abandoned a patient, about the needle decompression that had saved a life, she simply said what she'd always said. I did what any nurse would do. I took care of my patient. But that night, when she pressed her hand against the scar tissue on her left lung, the scar from Kandahar, from carrying the general through fire, from surviving things that were never declassified, she understood something that Sterling never would. Some victories aren't about being noticed. Some victories are about surviving long enough to help someone else live. That's all it ever was. That's all it ever needed to be. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you appreciated Ashley's story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another moment of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Drop a comment below, what would you have done in her position? And share this with someone who needs to remember that true strength is often quiet, often invisible, and often the person standing right beside you.